Hi, this is Hubwood and welcome to today's video where we will take a closer look at the performance of the brand new Nvidia GeForce MX 350, the successor of Nvidia's entry-level laptop gaming chip, the MX250. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical details of this card at the beginning, as this video is just supposed to put its focus on showing you the performance of this chip. You can find out more about the hardware that I used in the description, which also explains why I didn't use Shadowplay for recording. And I will also talk about this at the end of the video if you're really into this stuff. But now let's have a look at some games and how they performed. I was able to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080 in all games tested with at least 30 FPS. Be aware that most games ran a lot better using DirectX 11 instead of DirectX 12 in all games where choosing the rendering mode was an option. So as of today, I would recommend you to choose DirectX 11 in the graphics menu whenever possible. By the way, I tried to play Red Dead Redemption 2, which unfortunately didn't seem to work on the laptop I used. But I think that this will be fixed in the future. Since Shadowplay didn't work at all, after a few hours of tinkering around I gave up and switched over to recording with MSI Afterburner. Keep in mind that this reduces the FPS by around 10%. So what you see is not representing the actual FPS, but the graphics settings that I use for the benchmarks and the resulting FPS numbers I'll show for each game. First I ran 3D Mark Firestrike and achieved a graphics score of around 4400, which is exactly the same as for the GTX 960M and the famous budget desktop card, the GTX 750 Ti. Now the first real game we're testing today is the brand new Call of Duty Warzone. And this is the only title today for which I actually really recommend to lower the resolution to at least 900p in order to get a minimum of 30 FPS stable with the lowest possible settings. Recording took away quite a lot of FPS since the game is also very demanding for the CPU. Since this game is in quite an early state, this might get better in the future. Keep in mind that for COD Warzone you need at least 12 to 16GB RAM to play without lags or stuttering. The second game for today is Metro Exodus, which I played in 1080p with the lowest possible settings and using DirectX 11 and can provide around 33 FPS on average. But it seemed to be highly depending on the actual scene, and just turning around by 90 degrees could raise your FPS to 50 or lower it to 25. But since this is a single player title, 33 FPS might be enough. If you need more, you can of course always choose 900p. I also noticed that the outside areas seem to be much more demanding than caves, houses and the metro. The next game on my list is Overwatch, which is a perfect example for a well-fitting game for the MX350. On 1080p and the medium preset I saw an average of 67 FPS with a 1% low of 35 FPS. The overall experience was very good, fluid and without any stuttering or lags. The first mainstream battle royale game, PUBG, fixed a lot of performance issues over the years and was playable with around 54 FPS on average and a 1% low of 29 with low settings on 1080p. Choosing very low settings would get you a stable 60 FPS. I'm happy to inform you, it was a good experience. Up next is Fortnite, which I always test on 1080p with everything set to very low except for the viewing distance, which was set to very high. That gave me an average of 91 FPS and a 1% low of 50, which is just perfectly playable. But to be honest, I was expecting a bit more. But then again, the game is becoming more hardware demanding lately. By the way, recording reduced the FPS by quite a lot. For Rainbow Six Siege, I have to admit I only ran the benchmark, which gave me an average of 70 FPS on the lowest settings in 1080p with a 1% low of around 40. But that seems just very playable to me. Don't mind the frame times shown in the video, they were all over the place as soon as I started recording. The next game I tested is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which ran with about 34 FPS on the lowest settings in 1080p and a 1% low of 22. It is playable, but again you might be happier with choosing 900p. Even medium settings with 900p could be a better option as the game starts to look kind of ugly without any shadows. Pun intended. I will probably test The Witcher 3 with every system until the day I die, and so here we are watching Geralt on 1080p with medium settings and an average FPS of 32 and a 1% low of 24. On slower systems I usually play this game with an FPS cap at 30 FPS to reduce some frame time spikes here and there. In cities, stable frame times also really depend on the CPU you're using. Rocket League was one of the best performing titles I've tested with this GPU, meaning on 1080p and ultra settings I saw an average of 78 FPS and a 1% low of 45 FPS, providing both an excellent experience performance-wise and considering the way it looked. Like Overwatch, this is another title that makes a lot of sense on such entry-level gaming laptop chips. I was actually pleasantly surprised with the performance of Anno 1800 on 1080p and medium settings with an average of 36 FPS and a 1% low of 15 FPS. Since this is a strategy game, that's absolutely fine. Even zooming out on a big city worked pretty well, but keep in mind the CPU plays quite a big role here too. I wasn't able to use DirectX 12 as it resulted in an FPS loss of almost 50%. Whereas DirectX 11 caused some weird frame time issues which I gladly accepted for an overall higher frame rate. Apex Legends performed alright with an average of 52 FPS and a decent 1% low of 32 FPS on 1080p with the lowest possible settings. Choosing 900p might be a good way to get a closer to stable 60 FPS with a MX350. But I would still consider it playable if you're not planning on becoming a professional player. FIFA 2020 ran pretty well with an average of 59 FPS and a 1% low of 27 FPS on medium settings and 1080p. Absolutely enjoyable and thanks to Corona probably the only way to watch a new soccer match in 2020. Battlefield 5 was a bit of a problem as I only saw around 43 FPS on average at 1080p with very low settings and a 1% low of 28. Especially on big maps I had some severe frame time issues and quite a lot of stuttering and spikes, which could also be due to the slowish laptop CPU being overwhelmed. Being another light esports title, CSGO performed very well. Since this is a more CPU based title, I wanted to put some weight on the GPU and chose medium settings on 1080p, which gave me a very decent 95 FPS on average with a 1% low of 60 FPS. But to be honest, I didn't expect otherwise for a game that is rumored to be playable on toasters. Up next was Doom from 2016, which is a very good performing title on most systems as well. On high settings and 1080p I saw an average of 88 FPS with a 1% low of 45 FPS. But I have to admit it felt like there was a higher input lag than the frame time should have provided. It felt kind of sluggish. But since I'm no expert on Doom, I'm not sure if this is a common issue or if it was just my imagination. Far Cry 5 performed with an average of 36 FPS on 1080p and lowest settings, with a 1% low of 22 FPS. Playable for a single player game, but be aware that the 2GB of VRAM the MX350 provides seem to be occupied very quickly and could cause some stuttering here and there, as well as a cut in FPS. Fallout 4 isn't the newest title on today's list and therefore it's not as hardware demanding as most AAA titles I've tested. On 1080p and medium settings I was able to get a decent 51 FPS on average with a 1% low of around 30 FPS. That is quite satisfying both in visuals and performance, as the FPS never went lower than 30 FPS and sometimes even hit the 60 FPS mark. I've tested GTA 5 with normal settings, which is basically low, as most options won't go any lower than normal. But the game still looks alright in 1080p and I saw an average of 70 FPS with a 1% low of almost 50 FPS. So you could even use this laptop to play GTA Online with high frame rates. And of course there's always some headroom for higher settings and still getting around 60 FPS if you prefer that. Kingdome Come Deliverance is another very hardware demanding title and expressed that with an average of 31 FPS on the low preset and 1080p with a not very satisfying 1% low of 19 FPS. The frame times seem to be all over the place and even with stable 30 FPS stuttering happened quite a lot. I also had severe heat issues with the laptop I used in this game, as it often happened that after a few minutes of gaming, both the CPU and the GPU became so hot the laptop had to downclock and the FPS totally dropped down to about 8 FPS for 1 to 2 minutes. So be aware and maybe choose 900p and cap the FPS at 30 to prevent overheating if that happens to you too. I have to admit I only ran the benchmark for the Division 2, which gave me an average of 41 FPS at the lowest settings on 1080p, but I'm guessing that is kind of playable even for a multiplayer title, as the frame times seem stable enough without showing any big spikes or drops in performance. Watchdogs 2 looked and performed surprisingly well, even though I had to choose 1080p and the lowest settings, which gave me around 37 FPS on average, with a very stable 1% low of 29 FPS. And I have to say it felt very smooth and playable, definitely recommendable. World of Tanks is another title in which I only ran the benchmark, but this time on ultra settings and 1080p, which resulted in an average of 38 FPS with a 1% low of 29 FPS. Considering that I was using ultra, I'm sure you can get very high FPS on lower settings. Forza Horizon 4 achieved over 60 FPS on average when choosing the lowest settings and 1080p. And this game doesn't seem to know what bad frame times or frame drops of any kind even are, as I experienced absolutely none of those when I wasn't recording the game. A great racing experience. I've also decided to test some older and non-performance hungry games, like for example Life is Strange 2, which ran with about 40 FPS on average at 1080p and high settings, with a 1% low of 25, which doesn't really matter in a point-and-click style interactive movie adventure. Great experience, worked absolutely fine and looked great. Prey is a game I really enjoyed, and it ran with an average of 52 FPS on medium settings combined with a decent 1% low of 32. The game looks pretty good on medium, and the MX350 delivered an excellent experience for my taste. The performance of Blended Coaster highly depends on the size of your park, the CPU and the number of guests you're currently having. I've tested it with both small and big park on 1080p and medium settings, and it ran with about 23 FPS on average with a 1% low of 16, which sounds really bad, but since it's such a slow-paced simulator aka roller coaster building game, it's enough to enjoy yourself. By the way, it even stutters with my RTX 2080 on my desktop, since it's just not optimized for huge parks with a lot of people in them. Of course, League of Legends wouldn't be a problem for the MX350 and performed with an average of 154 FPS on 1080p with maximum settings combined with a 1% low of 106. That's basically all you can ask for, nothing to criticize here. Next game please. Metro 2033 was another game for which I've only tested the benchmark, and it ran with around 50 FPS on average at 1080p and high settings, delivering a solid performance without big spikes in frame times, which could be due to the smaller levels you're experiencing in this title. The Elder Scrolls Skyrim was almost able to present itself with its maximum possible FPS of 60 on average at 1080p with ultra settings. But then again, it's almost 10 years old now, so it really shouldn't be a problem even for a budget mobile GPU like the MX350. Very fluid and smooth, nothing to complain about here. Yes, Assassin's Creed Odyssey performed well enough to enjoy with an average of 34 FPS and a 1% low of 20 FPS on the lowest settings and 1080p. But keep in mind that this game also demands a decent CPU to function in an acceptable way. I had some stuttering here and there, but overall it's playable if you're okay with 30 FPS in a single player action RPG. By the way, if you're not, you probably shouldn't buy a laptop with a MX350 anyway. Tomb Raider from 2013 was another older title I've tested, and the benchmark ran with an average of around 40 FPS on high settings. Considering you could use high or medium settings and get higher frame rates, this title should perform really well on the MX350. Again, for Shadow of Mordor, I only ran the benchmark, mainly because I don't enjoy playing the game, on the high preset with an average of 42 FPS and a 1% low of around 20. Shouldn't be a problem, especially on medium or lower settings then. Ah, but can it run Crysis? Yes, it can. Of course it can. I mean, Crysis is 14 years old now. And by the way, just recently a remake of Crysis 1 has been announced, just in case you've missed that. I saw an average of 33 FPS on very high settings on 1080p, which is also due to the fact that the game is badly optimized in terms of CPU usage. But the 1% low was a disappointing 14 FPS, which could be because of the stuttering when the game was autosaving once in a while. Diablo 3 was a no-brainer and achieved 68 FPS on maximum settings on 1080p with a 1% low of 35 FPS. Absolutely smooth, enjoyable and good looking. No problems here. Another title where the MX350 can shine at least a bit. Dirt Rally ran with an average of 54 FPS on high settings with a 1% low of 28, and it's a good racing experience and can be enjoyed without bigger issues. But then again, this title also is a bit older by now, and of course racing games usually tend to run better compared to other genres. Far Cry 3 was another older title that I wanted to benchmark, and it ran with an OK 43 FPS on average with a 1% low of 33 FPS on maximum settings. And I would say the overall experience was alright. Please note that recording heavily reduced the FPS for this title, which I actually didn't quite understand. Bioshock Infinite performed pretty well with 59 FPS on average and a 1% low of 25 on ultra settings and 1080p. In some areas the game seemed to struggle though and went down to the 40 FPS range, but still it was playable very well even on ultra. The last game for today was Assassin's Creed 3, which, yes, that's weird, is my favorite Assassin's Creed title considering the story. Even though it's from 2012, I only saw an average of 43 FPS on maximum settings at 1080p with a 1% low of 33 FPS. But it still was an okay experience overall. Lowering the settings would of course certainly help increasing the FPS. Now, I was experiencing some severe boost clock issues with the MX350 by the way, meaning that the maximum boost megahertz could not be stabilized and jumped up and down after a while when the chip got warmer. And sometimes it even started with 1354 MHz on a cooled chip. So I figured it also depended on the game, guessing that some games need a higher CPU power, leading to the problem that the whole laptop only gets 65 watt and therefore has to cut down the GPU a little bit. You can play every game if you're okay with choosing less than 1080p on low settings to get a decent frame rate in newer titles. In fact, considering that this GPU will mostly be used in small and lightweight laptops, a lower resolution won't look as bad since the pixel density is still high enough on a small screen. Or in other words, 720p doesn't look as bad on a laptop screen as it would on a big desktop monitor. Now the laptop I use for testing, a Lenovo Ideapad 5, only has a 65 watt PSU, so there was absolutely no headroom for overclocking. And I have to say that it didn't do a good job at cooling the CPU or the GPU while gaming. It was equipped with an Intel i7-1065G7, which is a 4-core 8-thread low-power CPU, meaning it only uses about 15 to 25 watt depending on the laptop model. And I'm guessing that the MX350 will come in many variations considering the CPU combination in the next month, and your model might be a bit faster or slower due to your chosen CPU. Furthermore, it came with 60 GB of RAM, which at least made it easy to exclude the RAM as a bottleneck. Unfortunately, Shadowplay didn't work at all, and after a few hours of tinkering around I gave up and switched over to recording with MSI Afterburner. And keep in mind that this reduces the FPS by around 10 to 20%, so what you see is not representing the actual FPS, but the graphics settings that I use for the benchmarks, and the resulting FPS numbers I'll show for each game. And in quite a lot of games the frame time graph was all over the place and frame times seemed to be bad, even though the actual gaming experience was okay. I'm not sure if that's due to the low power CPU or if that's just been a mistake in displaying the frame times. Also, right now the MX350 seems to be only available with 2 GB of RAM, which is definitely not enough for many games in 2020. But considering that most games will only run in a satisfying way with low settings anyhow, you might get away with it in most titles. Last but not least, we have to keep in mind that the MX350 is very new and some of the issues I had might be driver related and could be fixed in the future. So basically the performance should have improved if you're watching this anytime later than the summer of 2020. Since the making of this video took me dozens of hours besides having a full-time job and 2 little kids, I would highly appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel or leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the content. Thank you very much, see you next time, bye bye.